The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
But one of the things that gets noticed less is a pretty decent chunk of the speech effectively says to be a watchman on the walls for freedom means not just looking out, but looking in. And this was one of the fears that Kennedy had about domestic extremism and domestic misinformation that feels uncannily relevant today.
In November 1963, President Kennedy was set to give a speech in Dallas excoriating the increasing amount of misinformation and the politicians and public figures that spread those lies and half-truths for their own political gain. But that speech was never delivered because he was assassinated the day before. This episode, speechwriter and author Jeff Nussbaum joins us to look at some undelivered speeches from the 1960s, including two from President Kennedy that could have changed history. Stay with us for our conversation next on JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter. Welcome to JFK 35. On this podcast, we have analyzed and delved deeply into many speeches delivered by President John F. Kennedy. Today, we'll look at speeches written for the president during his time in office, but that he ended up never delivering. Joining me to discuss this topic is Jeff Nussbaum, a former political speechwriter for Senator Tom Daschle, Vice President Al Gore, and most recently for President Joe Biden, among many others. Nussbaum is the author of a new book, Undelivered, the never-heard speeches that would have rewritten history. Jeff, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So Jeff, this book, Undelivered, the never-heard speeches that could have rewritten history, is the book that you've written. What made you want to write this book about these speeches that were not heard?
Sure. So this is a passion that began on election night 2000. I was a kid speechwriter for Al Gore. I'm no longer a kid speechwriter. But on election night 2000, I was left at one point holding three speeches Al Gore didn't give: a victory, a concession, and then coincidentally, we thought he would win the Electoral College but lose the popular vote. The opposite ultimately happened. But that night, Gore gave no speech. And ironically for the book, it's one of the few chapters where I've lost the speeches, so I don't have them. But that sent me on this quest to say, where are the other places in history? Where are the other times in history? And not just elections, where the outcome is so in doubt, or the outcome is so precarious, or the outcome is subject to change such to the extent that a leader looked at the alternate outcome and envisioned it, and left a speech, basically starting us down a path of this alternative history.
And in this book, you not only talk about the unwritten speeches, it's not like you just put them there, but you give your own analysis of the speeches from your speechwriter point of view. Why do you think that was important for you to add that critical analysis?
Yeah, well, I'm neither a journalist nor a historian, but this book gave me the opportunity to be both of those things. And one of the things that I really enjoyed doing in writing this book is not just plopping down a speech on the page and saying, look, I found this draft that was never delivered, make of it what you will. But I really take more time to try to recreate these moments in history to show how fraught they were, to show how precarious they were, and then to try to pull back the curtain a little bit on what's the speechwriting process like in moments like these? What were the conversations that were taking place? And what did those conversations ultimately yield? And so when I share the speech, it's kind of a coda on the chapter as opposed to the chapter in its entirety.
And it's all very interesting, which is why I want to get right into the speeches. You have three speeches in your book that relate to the Kennedy era. The first one I'd like to talk about directly is one by John Lewis, who at the time was leading SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But before we get to his speech, can you set the scene? It was the March on Washington, and it was a massive organizing effort, and there was a lot of pressure on the organizers to keep what was a very broad coalition together. Can you set the scene and tell us about some of those pressures that they were facing?
Yeah, absolutely. So John Lewis, as you mentioned, was leading SNCC, which was really the most active youth wing of the civil rights movement. And over time, we sort of sand off the edges of our heroes. And later in life, John Lewis became almost a heroic but kind of warm and cuddly civil rights character. He was neither warm nor cuddly. He had been in the fight. He had had his bus firebombed on the Freedom Rides. He wasn't on it at the time, but he had been arrested a couple of dozen times at that point. He had seen the worst of what the fight for civil rights required, and he wanted to use the March on Washington as an opportunity to share that. As he said, I didn't want it to be a march in Washington, I wanted it to be a march on Washington. Meanwhile, the other organizers were working more establishment channels. The Catholic Church was involved, the labor movement was involved, civil rights leaders who had been kind of the Moses generation, and to a certain extent, John Lewis was the next generation coming along. They wanted this march to be a successful, meaningful, unifying march that would help push some progress on civil rights. And Lewis, again, prepared a very fiery speech, a speech that later Martin Luther King said to him in trying to get him to tone it down, said, John, this doesn't sound like you. And Lewis said, yeah, but it sounds like us. And by us, he meant SNCC. He meant the youth movement. And so that was really the scene. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that when you are overseeing a multi-speaker event, and I had the chance to help oversee several Democratic National Conventions from the speechwriting side, everyone is ostensibly on the same page. Everyone does have a shared agenda, but everyone also has their own brand and their own agenda and their own audience. And so in this chapter, I write about what happened to John Lewis and how he ultimately modified his speech, but I also write about the pressures in trying to get everyone on the same page.
So how would you describe the initial speech that Lewis wanted, that he felt represented his group, SNCC, and sort of the areas of concern from the other more establishment organizers?
This is a great question, because one of the things I have in the book, Undelivered, is actually a visual of what language fell out and what language went in. But one of the things he wanted to say was that in good conscience, we cannot support wholeheartedly the administration's civil rights bill, for it is too little and too late. He said that we wanted to march through Georgia the way Sherman did and burn segregation to the ground. He said, basically, we're living in a police state. He talked about the violence that had been done to other civil rights activists. He described the people who counseled patience. He chided them and said, patience is a dirty and nasty word. And all of these added up to a speech that would by far have been the fieriest and angriest of the day. Not unjustifiably so, but out of step with the theme that the organizers really wanted to push.
And there was a concern, right? Because one of the principal leaders and the first person to speak was the Cardinal, and people were really worried about him pulling out, if you want to talk about why that was and how that related to President Kennedy's support of the march.
Yeah, one of the things I do in the book is I project forward what happens if the speech that they want to give gets given. And in the case of the Cardinal, there was a little bit of a set of dominoes that could have been tipped over here. Kennedy relied heavily on the blessing of the Catholic Church to sort of sanitize the march. Look, the church can be for it, church-going families can be there. But in particular, it was the line about patience being a dirty and nasty word, patience being kind of a virtue, especially in Catholicism. There was some worry, and the Cardinal himself said, if this speech doesn't change, I pull out. So you can imagine a scene in which the Cardinal pulls out of the march, refuses to bless it. Kennedy becomes very uncomfortable with it, and then kind of cascades from there, because ultimately, after the march, Kennedy embraced it. Kennedy invited the leaders to the White House. Kennedy kind of used that as an effort to trigger more progress on the Civil Rights Bill. But one of the things I often say is, or frequently say when I talk about this, is you can imagine a very different march in which Lewis gives the speech he wanted to give, and actually Martin Luther King gives a speech he wanted to give, or not that he wanted to give, that his advisors wanted him to give, which was also a little angrier and a little combative. And that speech was called Normalcy Never Again. And the idea was, there are some who are saying we can make some progress on civil rights when we return to normalcy, and King's advisors wanted him to say, let's be clear, there will be normalcy never again. So there's an alternate universe in which we hear about the nightmare and not the dream, and what flows from the march is a little more tempered.
And so there were some people in the organizer, particularly I think Dr. King and A. Philip Randolph, who went to John Lewis and, said, this is important. Can you describe their urging of him to, try to make the speech work?
Yeah, so I've witnessed things like this before at Democratic conventions. Basically, poor John Lewis gets brought to the woodshed. He gets called back, kind of to the back of the Lincoln Memorial, and he's being told, change this. And this is the moment at which King says, John, this doesn't sound like you. Everyone is trying to get him to change his speech. And Lewis is getting his back up. He's frustrated. And so he's kind of flanked by two of his closest advisors, Jim Foreman and Cortlandt Cox. And one of the fun things in the book is I found in the archives this wonderful photo of John Lewis huddling with Jim Foreman and Cortlandt Cox and Mildred Foreman, Jim Foreman's wife, underneath the arm of Abraham Lincoln, reworking his speech. And the reason he was reworking his speech is because, as you mentioned, the grandfather of the whole enterprise, A. Philip Randolph, basically begged him. He said, John, we've come this far together. Let us stay together. And that was finally the moment at which Lewis said, okay. In fact, Randolph said, I've waited 22 years for this. I've waited all my life for this opportunity. Please don't ruin it. And that was a plea that John Lewis couldn't turn down.
And so in the end, the original fiery speech wasn't heard. How did people react to the edited speech? I believe it was still fiery compared to the rest.
Indeed. It was the fieriest speech of the day. And this is something I often tell the speakers when I work with them. People don't hear what you didn't say. They hear how you say what you did say. And there was no mistaking what Lewis's message was. Lewis's message was, we're not just in a fight for civil rights, we're in a fight for our lives. We're in a fight for the soul of the nation. And so even though it wasn't the speech he wanted to give, he said years later in retrospect, it was still a good speech. It still delivered the message. I didn't compromise on the message. I may have compromised on some of the language.
It's a fantastic story, and there's so much more to get into. I hope readers can read that story. But I want to move on to another speech. The next two, both from President Kennedy. This one occurred in what was now known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union was helping secretly put medium and long-range ballistic missiles that could reach the American mainland in Cuba. Again, before we get into the speech, if you want to just set the scene of what was happening at that moment when the speech was being crafted.
Yeah, so Kennedy learns from his national security advisor that they now have photos of missile sites in Cuba. So here we are, October 19th, 1962. President Kennedy is about to make a campaign trip to Cleveland, Ohio, but that morning he learns from his national security advisor that they have images of missile sites being built on the island of Cuba, Russian missiles. And very quickly, he's presented with a choice. The military advisors, many of the military leaders, say we need to go in with a massive number of airstrikes and take out these missiles before they become operational. And Kennedy's a little uncomfortable with this, but this seems to be the consensus. But he takes a breath and sets up his ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, which was kind of a rump body of senior national security and military leaders to help figure out what course of action to take. And he doesn't agree to the airstrikes immediately. He wants options. And so Robert Kennedy, his brother, the Attorney General, essentially divides the ExComm into two groups, an airstrike group and a blockade group, a naval blockade of Cuba, and charges them each with putting together a recommendation and wants the recommendations topped with a speech to the nation. The idea being, and a clever one, I think, that we have to not only decide on a course of action, but our ability to articulate that course of action is a good way of knowing whether it's the right course of action. And so these two groups go off to start working on a speech. And by the way, it was a later story about this whole episode in history that becomes the first known usage of the term hawks and doves, war hawks and Picasso doves. And so we have the hawkish airstrike group, the slightly more dovish blockade group, and they go to both figure out a course of action, but also to figure out how the president would announce such a course of action.
You mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that there are often speechwriters who have to write multiple versions depending on what happens. So here we see an alternate version if they decided to do an airstrike. What do you think made the crafting this alternate version so significant?
One of the things that you see in this alternative version is when speechwriters write speeches, they will frequently have a parenthetical, like a journalist's TK, that information is to come. And in the airstrike speech, there is a parenthetical that says, follows a description of first reports of action. And I've said several times, that parenthetical could have meant everything to the fate of mankind. Because later, what we didn't know at the time, what we know now, is that many of those missiles were already operational. These weren't just missile sites, they were operational missiles. And what's more, the commanders on the ground, the battery commanders, had authority to launch them. They didn't need to go back to the Soviet Union for permission. So we look at this speech, and it lays out, the airstrike speech and the blockade speeches are quite similar in that they're laying out the predicate for action. It's largely the action that becomes the difference. But one of the minor mysteries, if finding undelivered speeches was an obsession for me, the obsession within the obsession is who wrote the speech? McGeorge Bundy never commented or said anything about having written it, and Ted Sorensen denied it, largely denied it. Sorensen, because it was sort of morally abhorrent to him, he had been a conscientious objector in World War II. And so I kind of did the best research I could do to figure out, okay, who did write it? I even had a FBI forensic analyst look at the handwriting on the draft, and it's clear that Bundy at one point edited it because his handwriting is on it. But some of the other research I did, including an interview with Ted Sorensen that was never made public, indicates that he actually wrote a lot of it. And so I went into how could he have written it, and it used some terms that only Sorensen used, either watchword or byword. I have to go look. But so the question was beyond the question of the fate of the world. And there's this wonderful bit of audio that we have in the audiobook where Curtis LeMay says to President Kennedy, you're in a pretty bad fix. And Kennedy kind of scoffs and says, well, you're in there with me. But so the question is, well, if Sorensen did write it, is it possible that he just blacked out that he wrote it? And I went and excavated my own archives, because at one point I had to write a speech in favor of the Iraq War resolution that I didn't really feel good about. And I remember everything about the process of writing that speech. But when I look at the speech now, if you showed it to me now, I'd say, I didn't write that. I don't recognize that. So one of the things RFK said in this crisis, and he says it in his book 13 Days, is that the stress of this was doing a lot of funny things to our minds. And so the question is, could Sorensen have actually written this and effectively forgotten or had his mind black out that he had written it? And the answer is absolutely. It makes a lot of sense to me.
You mentioned as a speechwriter in these stressful situations, a lot of strange things can happen. Obviously, this probably being the most stressful situation maybe that Ted Sorensen was put in. What is it like for a speechwriter to try to have to think and put something like this together? And, what is it like when you have to imagine putting together two different drafts of something involving like as serious as a nuclear war?
Yeah, well, luckily I haven't had to write under such high stakes. But it is a challenge because leaders, first and fundamentally, need to be explainers. And one of the things you see in this draft speech is a lot of time is spent explaining, how did this come to be? What rules is the Soviet Union actually breaking? What are they doing wrong? What promises have they broken? Why is this destabilizing? Why can't we live with this situation? So the first job is explain. The second job then becomes persuade. So here I've explained what's happening, and now my job is to persuade you why the course of action I'm setting forward is the right course of action. And this is where most speeches have, and I talk about this in the book, 5 steps in persuasion. It's attention, get the audience's attention, problem, solution, visualization, call to action. And in this case, the problem, of course, was the buildup on the island of Cuba. That's the explanation, some time spent explaining that. The solution then is the course of action. In this case, it's the blockade. But the visualization step is a step a lot of people forget in persuasive speeches, which is it's not simply enough for Kennedy to say, I'm solving the problem with this step. It's let's visualize what the world looks like when this problem is solved. And that's where a leader, a president, has something really unique to say. Because we look to our presidents to say, not just, I see the problem, not even, I'm solving the problem, but what does the solution of this problem say about America?
In the 60s, communication was a lot simpler. The avenues of being able to get your message out was a lot simpler. And I kind of, you being a professional speechwriter in the 21st century, what do you think is the unique differences if like something like Cuba in that situation were to happen today rather than in 1960, as far as from the communications end of the unique challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question because it was easier for a president to hold the nation's attention, right? If the Cuban Missile Crisis happened today, people would say, oh my goodness, this is happening today, as we are saying with Ukraine. We're paying a lot of attention to Ukraine, but we're also paying a lot of attention to the Johnny Depp trial and the slap at the Oscars. And so there's more things out there, more noise out there that siphons attention away from the things that are truly important and truly existential. And I think we see that a lot now with folks who are trying to get some more attention paid to the climate crisis. We don't do a great job at distinguishing between the existential and the important and the entertaining. And so in a sense, Kennedy was lucky that he could command the nation's attention. And his successful dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis, because everyone was paying attention, skyrocketed him to levels of popularity that have barely been equaled since among presidents. But it's not just about popularity, it's about, okay, to your question, how do you command attention? And that's one of the challenges speechwriters face now. I often joke that I do a job that could be done with a quill and ink or chisel and marble. It's analog stuff. But speeches now become source documents, almost Rosetta Stones, that are mined for all of that other content. The speech becomes the source for the tweet, the source for the Instagram post, the source. And so if it happened today, we would never hear the full blockade speech, but we would see it chopped up into a million little pieces and delivered to us via Twitter, delivered to us via Instagram, delivered to us in a million different ways.
So it sounds like you're saying in one way, while the national address to the nation may be harder to get people to watch the full situation like it was in the 60s, where it captivated everybody's attention, but in also a way, your national speech still is shared through the new means of communication. Exactly right. So I want to turn our attention to JFK's last speech, the speech never given that was supposed to be given the day after he was assassinated in Dallas. Again, because I think it's so important. Kennedy was going to give this speech to a number of different groups, the government officials, business organizations, community leaders. It was sort of an early campaign kickoff. Again, set that scene. What is the challenge that you described of trying to address groups with different agendas and points of view?
That day in Dallas, President Kennedy did have several different groups that were merged together. And we sometimes joke in speechwriting circles that the audience in the front of the room serves really as props to get a message to the audience in the back of the room. In this case, these audiences were important. This was, as you mentioned, effectively a campaign kickoff. Kennedy was popular, but his popularity was declining significantly in the South, largely over civil rights. And Texas was going to be his blue wall at the time. And so this was an important state, and he had an important message to deliver to these groups. And when you're speaking to disparate groups, you're trying to find a theme that unifies all of them. And in this case, he hatched on the theme of the linkage between learning and leadership, that we need to have strong education systems, strong businesses if we are to be national leaders. And that's the theme he found. And when the speech is thought about now, to the extent that people know it, they think of it as a foreign policy speech. And indeed it is. It talks about America's strength, that we must remain the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. But one of the things that gets noticed less is a pretty decent chunk of the speech effectively says to be a watchman on the walls for freedom means not just looking out, but looking in. And this was one of the fears that Kennedy had about domestic extremism and domestic misinformation that feels uncannily relevant today.
And before we get to that relevance, what was Kennedy talking about in terms of the 1960s when he was talking about sort of these problems from within?
Yeah, so in particular, he had in mind people like Edwin Walker, who was a former World War II general who had helped foment riots at the University of Mississippi when the school attempted to integrate in 1962. This is Walker had run as a fringe candidate for governor of Texas. And here's the type of language that he was using to describe civil rights demonstrations in Washington, Texas. Quote, pro-Kennedy, pro-communist, and pro-socialist. He had accused Kennedy of being lax on communism and, quote, appointing anti-Christians to federal office. Now, Walker was a fringe player at the time, but one can imagine and one sees modern-day Walkers wherever we look, and they're not so fringe anymore. They're winning primaries, they're winning seats in Congress, and they have larger megaphones than Walker had. At the time, Walker was handing out pamphlets. Now you can hand out pamphlets to millions of people in one fell swoop on Facebook.
And so that uncanny situation, some of those conversations where I think you said it, maybe you want to read this part, but Kennedy talks about voices that are heard in the land sort of divorced from reality and warning people about the suspicion of government, people who foment the suspicion of government and its employees more than, say, the enemies abroad. That all seems so relevant today.
Incredibly relevant. And he actually draws an interesting distinction. He kind of talks about constant complainers. He calls them dissident voices who will always be, quote, expressing opposition without alternatives, finding fault but never favor, perceiving gloom on every side, and seeking influence without responsibility. He's basically saying, whiners, these whiners. And he says, quote, they're inevitable. But while he accepted the inevitability of dissident voices, he was more concerned about those who knowingly promote and spread lies. And I say in the book, in language that could easily apply to President Trump and his disingenuous claims of fake news, and here's a quote from the speech, but today other voices are heard in the land, voices preaching doctrines wholly unrelated to reality, wholly unsuited to the 60s, doctrines which apparently assume words will suffice without weapons, that vituperation is as good as victory, and that peace is a sign of weakness. And later in the speech he says, ignorance and misinformation can handicap the progress of a city or a company, but they can, if allowed to prevail in foreign policy, handicap this country's security. And I wonder if he had delivered the speech, if he had had a chance to edit it more, would he have taken out that clause if allowed to prevail in foreign policy? Because the point still stands. Ignorance and misinformation can handicap the progress of a city or a company or a country's security.
There's a tension on the speech because it was the one he would have delivered. What do you think if he had delivered this speech? I mean, would it have just been another campaign speech, or do you think it was a speech that would have stood out?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say. There's another lovely line in here who says, we cannot expect that everyone, to use the phrase of a decade ago, will talk sense to the American people, but we can hope that fewer people will listen to nonsense. I think a line like that may have made people sit up and listen. You know, the president basically chiding you, saying, stop listening to nonsense. It could have made a difference for sure. One of the things that I did in the process of writing this chapter, as in several chapters, is I looked at all the information that the speechwriter, in this case Sorensen, gathered. And there's another chapter in the book where I actually don't have Condoleezza's speech that she intended to give on September 11th on missile defense. It's still classified. But I was able to, through a Freedom of Information Act request, get all of the material that her team had put together. And it's fascinating to look at the material because it's just so clear to a speechwriter exactly what they were trying to do. In the case of Condoleezza Rice's speech, she had basically compiled a dossier of the arguments against missile defense and was going to debunk them one by one, or was going to attempt to debunk them. And here, when you look at the material Sorensen had, it was economic accomplishments for Texas. It was progress on oil and gas leases. It was even a collection of Texas humor, some jokes for the president to tell. And all of those things are the ingredients of your kind of standard political speech. But the fact that this speech didn't really use those things, it made a different argument, it made a bigger argument, tells you that this was really the beginning of a slightly different rhetorical approach to leadership. And that's why I think that had it been heard, it may have really been heard.
President Kennedy obviously didn't know what was about to happen, and this speech has sort of become like his final words just because of the situation, the position it's in. What do you think it says, the speech, about President Kennedy and the legacy he wanted to leave behind based on what you've read and saw?
Yeah, and before I answer that question, one thing I'll say is, in this book, the last chapter is called Last Words, and it's various leaders across time and location who didn't know that the end was coming. Albert Einstein was preparing a speech for Israel Independence Day. Pope Pius XI, fascinatingly, was preparing a speech in which he was going to disavow Mussolini and basically speak out against fascism. FDR was about to give a speech looking past the end of World War II and describing not just an end to war, but an end to the beginning of all wars. And then Kennedy was going to talk about national security. And one of the things I draw, the line to me that becomes clear through all of these, is these four leaders were each really talking about peace and how to achieve it. What is required for us to live in peace with each other and with others outside our borders, outside our tribes, outside our communities? And so Kennedy's, like those other speeches, I think speaks to his desire to create a world that felt safe for a democratic, pluralistic, progressive society. And I think that's one of his lasting legacies. That's why we cling so tightly to his words, spoken and unspoken today, because they painted such a clear picture of the nation he wanted us to be then and the nation we still want to be today.
And just a couple more questions. One of them, Kennedy and Sorensen were very close. The relationship between candidate or elected official and speechwriter is a really unique one. And as a speechwriter yourself, tell us about that. What is the importance between the leader and their speechwriter?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was so clear in the Kennedy administration is that there were several people around him who were poets second and thought partners first. And at its best, it is a relationship between a thought partner, someone who effectively becomes the speaker's alter ego, someone who doesn't set out to write the Platonic ideal of a speech, but sets out to write a speech that's authentic to that speaker. And so Kennedy had that. One of the things I say is when you look at speeches on paper, some of the most beautiful speeches are George W. Bush's speeches. But when you heard him deliver them, you'd sometimes think this is like a guy walking a tightrope, right? Is he going to make it to the end of this sentence? He will. And that's because there was a little bit of there was daylight between the quality and precision of the words and the guy speaking them. So to me, the relationship between a speaker and speechwriter is best when it becomes, as Senator Daschle, who's a wonderful mentor to me and someone who I just admired tremendously and loved working with, we got to a point where we would discuss a speech and I would ask if he needed to see it again if it was a small floor speech. And he said, no, this one's a rip and read. In other words, you get me, you get it, I can rip it out of your hand and read it. Which is not to say that he didn't engage with speeches. In fact, he wrote many of them himself. But the best possible relationship is the rip and read relationship, not because the speechwriter gets their stuff read word for word, but because it speaks to a certain level of trust and understanding.
And that's just going to be an amazing feeling to feel for you as a speechwriter, to know you've earned that trust. The last question I just want to touch on, and I'm glad you mentioned poetry, because that's my last question. Kennedy believed strongly in the power of poetry. He has that quote, "When power corrupts, poetry cleanses." But it was very important for him. So as a professional speechwriter, again, where do you think President Kennedy stands among maybe some of his presidential peers when it came to his emphasis on writing and oratory? Like, is it unique, or is it something that, like, was he typical, or was he sort of unique?
It's kind of an ebb and flow. He was unique in many ways. If you look at his speeches now, they are beautiful, but you can't quite imagine a politician getting up there and giving a Kennedy speech word for word today, because through the poetry, they both elevate the rhetoric and they sort of elevate Kennedy, but they're unabashedly elite. And a lot of leaders today see the job not as giving an oration, but having a conversation, which is not to say that speeches can't be sophisticated and they can't be beautiful, but the goal in some of Kennedy's speeches was to put him above and apart and make him almost an aspirational figure for the audience. And the goal of someone like President Clinton, who, we've all seen the image of Clinton basically draped over the podium, just talking to the audience, even though he was inspirational his own way, he wasn't delivering an oration, he was having a conversation. And so I think leaders choose what works for them. I think President Obama fell and falls more on the side of oratory. And it's just a question of what feels most authentic. Because if you look at the politicians who perform best, it's the politicians who people see are their true selves, right? Look at it this way. Both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders recently have been two politicians who have wildly overperformed expectations. And they don't have much in common, but what they do have is when you look at them and when you hear them, you say, that guy knows who he is and he's saying what he wants to say. And so it's really about the speaker finding what's most authentic for them.
Authenticity, that is the key. Jeff, thank you for sharing about your book and also some of your experiences as a speechwriter. We are really happy to have you. Is Undelivered on shelves? So Undelivered is available now. We'll have a link on our website. Thank you so much for joining us.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
If you are interested more on this subject, we'll have resources on our website, including copies of some of the text of the speeches you heard about today. You can visit our podcast page at jfklibrary.org/JFK35. There will also be a link to our recent Kennedy Library Forum with Jeff on YouTube. This is our last episode for Season 8. We do have a special announcement. This fall, our 9th season will be a special podcast series devoted to the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, featuring world-class historians, diplomats, and national security experts, and more. The series will begin in October. And if you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tweet at us at jfklibrary using the hashtag JFK35. If you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening and have a great summer.